So what we've seen is people actually do 50-50. We've seen all kind of configurations, and it depends on actually how you develop your workflows internally. So I don't think we have any specific recommendations. One of the things that we are adding as capabilities into the container registry itself is more granular control on the access, where you can actually, if you want to segregate the access for certain repositories, you can do that in a single registry. And previously, we've seen teams or customers using multiple container registries because the access to in the registry itself was not very granular. For example, if you don't want, let's say, developers to touch the production images directly or push to the production repositories, that was not very easy to implement. That's why customers decide, okay, I'll create a separate registry just for my production images, and I'll keep that with very strict access. Later in the year, about fall time, we'll have implementation which will allow you to actually very granularly restrict the access on the repositories, and then it's up to you what decision you want to make. If you want to make multiple or manage multiple registries, you can do that. If you want to have a single registry and restrict the access, you can do that.
Wonderful. Anyone else on our panel want to chime in? So I've got a thought or two. And I tend to fall on, I like to have separate, because I use a lot of infrastructure as code, I like to have separate things for each of my separate environments. So when I run through full deployments or any management changes, I get to play like I practice in every single environment. That's my preference. It can lead to slightly higher bills because I may have more, individual discrete resources depending on the types of things we're deploying. But personally, I tend to lean that way because I'd rather break something in my dev or QA environments and not have it reflect on what happened in my production environment. But that's me personally. All right. Do we any other questions that we have this morning? Otherwise, yes. Oh, no worries. Happy to have you here.
DIS as a service, specifically with options around Java web app servers or Java application servers.
All right. Now, let's see. Anyone on our panel want to address Java environments, JBoss environments on Linux? Aaron, you got any?
Not a lot, but I didn't quite hear the full question. So if you have any,
sorry, I should repeat that.
Yes.
He's looking for advice or ideas around or recommendations around JBoss environments on Azure on Linux or Java environments.
I don't have any specific ones, but our Java team, particularly Brian Benz, would have plenty of advice on that one. So it'd be great to connect. Talk more.
If you want to meet up with me after the session here, I'll point you towards Brian Benz and we can get you some recommendations.
Linux servers with Java applications from on-premise
Okay.
One of those customer applications, another one is actually a SaaS environment, SAS statistics.
Okay.
Runs across multiple Linux servers. It's a Java application, but the important part again is really in that case of hosting Linux.
Oh, hosting. Okay. Well, that leads me to one of the questions I wanted to ask. So Jim, can you just tell us a little more broadly about hosting Linux in Azure, and then maybe dive a little more specifically onto what Azure Linux means to that for that?
No.
All right.
No.
I knew I was going to regret this.
Somebody gave me an unsupervised microphone and a cup of coffee. It's a dangerous time. I think I would want to dig a little bit more into what specifically you were looking for around hosting a Linux image in Azure. Were there publication issues? Were you looking for vendor specifics? What can you give me a little more context? I don't want to just monologue too much.
No, actually, and feel free to cut me short. But the topic really has to do with really how Linux has, for instance, access to storage. So more specifically on the SaaS platform that we're moving to into Azure, SaaS can only access drives that that appear local. So either NFS or SMB are the limitations. So we're limited in using some of the storage solutions that our enterprise would like to have to get variances because they would actually prefer that we put files in SharePoint. And these are like spreadsheets that business users create that get consumed in analytics models. So we're leveraging Azure NetApp files so that we can do SMB3 encrypted. Then we run into Red Hat 9 doesn't support, or we have to go to Red Hat 9 because that's the only version that supports SMB3. But we run into encryption issues and issues with Active Directory and Kerberos, and so it starts to get complex once you're outside of the things that just, you know, if I was going with a Windows solution, Windows servers, this would be, you know, I'd be clicking on things, not really inventing.
Yeah, I'm glad we got to dive in and clarify there, because that seems like a much different question than like just general. No, it's good.
I would love to be able to answer that question. I am probably not the right person for it. Aaron, is that more in your vein, or am I throwing you under a bus for that one?
Somewhat under the bus, but I know the people who can help with that one. Particularly around the Azure NetApp files, we can definitely connect with people there.
Yeah. There's a number of bits of that stack, I think, that are going to require some different expertise views coming into that. And Aaron is definitely a good connector. I'll make sure that you get connected with Aaron.
We do focus a lot on these sort of end-to-end scenarios where we're bringing different workloads to Linux on Azure, and particularly exercising all the different parts of the stack, like Stephen's talking about, and bringing in files, bringing in different databases and all of these things. So these things are particularly of interest to us.
All right. I believe I saw another hand up over here. Yes. Actually, I'll just come over real quick.
This is for Linux virtual machines. I actually wanted to understand what are your thoughts on, I think recently Microsoft released AMD processor virtual machines. So what are the thoughts on Intel versus AMD processors?
Wonderful question. Because I just gave Jim a chance to talk, I'm going to let Paul start first, because I know Paul's been playing around with some of this, and then maybe we could go to Jim or go around if other folks have opinions. I think Aaron might too. So, Paul, why don't you lead us off?
Well, I would say I personally don't have a preference between Intel versus AMD. I think for it is probably going to be application specific. There are instances where maybe I've chosen a ARM64 OS, type, but in terms of like the processor, I can't recall if there's a reason why I switched either or. So it might be based on your application needs. So is there anything specific that? CPU. Right. So the follow-up was regarding memory or CPU. I think when you consider those factors, I think it's more along the lines of the SKU that you're going to be using for your Azure virtual machine. We have SKUs that are more like memory intensive, so you have a higher memory to CPU ratio. So I think just looking at the different types of
Yeah,
SKUs.
so for our current application in our company, we use the E series VMs, which are the memory
Yes.
optimized VMs.
Yes.
We are using Intel, and we want to see how or what will be the differences if we switch to AMD processors, because I think for the same either vCPU or the similar specs, AMD processors are cheap, like
Yeah.
more cost. Yeah.
Yeah, they're definitely lower cost because there's going to be some lower power consumption that goes into that, right?
And
Yeah, so
also,
what are the things that you should consider when you're thinking of moving, I guess?
yeah, I mean, generally I rely, is it like homegrown software or is it like vendor provided software? 'Cause
It is a homegrown.
it is
Yeah,
homegrown.
homegrown built on top of Linux. Or
So
I see.
do you have a strong test suite? We'll assume yes. Okay, I
Yeah,
won't
I mean-
put you on the spot. So if you have if you can validate the behavior of your application well, and you can get it to run on an ARM64 platform, that and the cost benefit can be very beneficial. It can also be beneficial if you're looking at it from a sustainability perspective. Because we're looking at lower power consumption, which, it can be beneficial to the bottom line because we're looking at it's reflected in cost, right? But there are certain runtimes and certain libraries and things that just aren't available on ARM64 SKUs. And it can add some complexity into your build and test environments. Like if you're developing on x86 and you're deploying onto ARM, if I'm building WebAssembly, no one cares, right? Like the difference is negligible. But if I'm building something, and Aaron's bumped into this with Python, right? There's some things in the Python world that don't play so nicely across ARM64 and x86 64. Jim, do you have any thoughts? I watched for you to pick up your coffee cup.
No, for us, we on the Azure Linux side specifically, we support x86 64 and ARM64. Most of the issues that we are finding are a bit further up the stack from the base operating system, either idiosyncrasies in Python math or stuff like that.
Yeah.
More in the customer workload side, where maybe the upstream software that they're trying to run doesn't support ARM64 yet. From an implementation and build standpoint, at least on the Azure Linux side, we have no issues there. We've been supporting ARM64 for, I want to say, a year or so now.
Okay. Rita, have you noticed anything in the ARM64 x86 divide?
I know AKS now has ARM64 nodes, and we make sure all the container images all support ARM now. So that's the nice thing about having like the same process for building your container images. If it works for one, it works for everybody. That's as far as the container world goes.
Okay. Aaron, did you want to chime in any on this?
Yeah, I was also going to just highlight something my colleague Rahul said here as well. It's often about benchmarking performance for the application. So if you have an application and you want to choose between different workloads, and even between Intel and AMD, and it always depends. Intel and AMD, obviously, you've got very portability there. It's very, very straightforward. And even across VM SKUs, you really just want to put the workload there, benchmark it, test it, run something like Azure load testing and all of the other things. I think we're getting fewer and fewer issues with ARM64 in particular over the day. So it's definitely worth testing and worth exploring. I'll put it that way. But everything else, it's often a cost thing. You look at well, we're paying this much for this SKU with this local disk or this thing, and I can jump to this other SKU, this ARM64 VM without a local disk, and I can get 20-30% cost reduction. Benchmark the app. Does it work? Is it suitable for that particular workload?
Yeah, that's where like understanding what today's performance is like and having a good test suite to make sure that things work as we explore that new platform really come into play.
And
that
so
also
we talked about some differences between or some capabilities, features that are not supported in the AMD VMs? Is there public documentation from Microsoft that?
Well, from up to the OS level, as Jim was mentioning, right? Like that's pretty well all supported. Where the differences start to come in is all the various runtimes and third-party libraries and things layering on top of that, and that's going to be very specific to your app environment and what you're running.
Okay.
Occasionally, you might see a specific SKU, for example, that may not support, say, nested virtualization. If you have a dependency on nested virtualization or something like that, you have to be careful picking your SKUs. But across the board, it's pretty compatible.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so we have a question coming in from online, so I'd like to give our online viewers a chance here. Now, this one harkens back to my my chef days, because we had a gentleman there who was very focused on building for AIX. Is it possible to host AIX in Azure? They've got some legacy AIX servers that are SAN attached. They're very old, AIX 7.2. Is it possible to host in Azure? And if so, what version of AIX would they need to require pre-migration? And that was from Imran, who's coming to us online. Do you need me to repeat the question?
Oh, no.
Oh. Any thoughts from our panel? Yeah, I that's something I do not know. I will take a note of that question and see if we can't get an answer to that. But I do not know. But we did have when I worked at Chef, we had a gentleman there who was he was our AIX expert and made sure our builds for Chef on AIX worked. And it was always interesting listening to him mumble about things that went well, things that didn't, and.
I do see there is an offering called SkyTap on Azure, which talks about bringing AIX workloads to Azure. So I'll drop the link in the chat here as well, so folks can learn more.
Wonderful. I knew it was going to be really handy having you here, Aaron. All right. Any other questions that we can answer here? Oh, yes. Hang on. I'll hand you the mic.
So regarding upgrading your cluster, we've got a cluster that's kind of far behind. In terms of upgrading them, is it easier to just from a perspective of infrastructure as code with automated deployments in that perspective, and making sure that drift is very minimal, is it better to just spin up another cluster using whatever general configuration we have and then deploying all of our containers, doing our Helm installs, and et cetera? Or would you guys recommend using like the built out of the, the portal AKS upgrade tool? Like, what's going to be the better approach?
All right, I'm going to kick that over to Rita for first crack at that.
Dare I ask how old?
1.19.
Okay.
1.19 was
Gotcha.
the answer.
So in general, our recommendation is you should definitely try to upgrade and use the latest and greatest as much as possible. Not only because you get to use new and more mature APIs, but more importantly, we want to make sure you stay safe, right? Secure. What I mean by that is, for example, I'm part of Kubernetes SRC, Security Response Committee. What we do is we take in all the security issues that people report, and then we make sure that they get properly patched across Kubernetes versions. However, these are supported versions, right? And so for Microsoft, AKS in this case, we're no different than any cloud providers, right? We generally try to take the latest and greatest from upstream, and we make sure those CVs are patched across our fleets, right? Now, what happens when you're running on really old Kubernetes versions? Chances are either they're not properly patched, right? Or they are patched, but probably backported by someone, and there potentially could be backward compatibility issues, right? So back to your question about what do you do in terms of upgrades versus migration? I don't know if you know this, but in Kubernetes proper, the recommendation is do version by version upgrade. Kubernetes in general does not support skip version upgrade. This is something the community is working very hard at. Something I personally am trying to help with as well. And for AKS in this case, this is also our recommendation, right? So if you were to do in-place upgrade, try to do one version at a time. That way you can also see what is broken. Is your workload actually running? And we also talked about obviously try to do this in your test infrastructure first. Don't do it in production. But also in general, if you have to skip versions, our general recommendation is migration, right? That way you make sure that at least the cluster itself is not at risk, right? So the cluster Kubernetes AKS is stable, and all you have to worry about is your workload, right? Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Great.
I do want to throw out one plug here for something that the AKS team announced at KubeCon for the LTS versions. So if you need to take longer time between your cluster migrations, or if you want to stay on a particular version,
Thank you for
this is your show.
Yeah, I didn't actually want to mention that. The reason for this is obviously it's not there yet, right? We made the announcement, and the reason we made the announcement is we want to make sure Kubernetes, we do this as a community, right? We want to make sure all the good work that we're putting into AKS are actually something that we contribute back to Kubernetes so other cloud providers can also take advantage. That way, when you, the customer, go between clouds, it's the similar experience, and you're not going to break your workload, right? So we made the announcement at KubeCon April, but obviously as a community, it's going to take a while to get us there. So I think right now, roughly, we're looking at 127, 128 being the first LTS version. Now the details is TBD because we're reviving the LTS working group. A bunch of companies are working together to see what do we mean by LTS, right? What do we mean, which versions we want to say that's the LTS version, right? How many versions between one LTS, right? And how long do you get the support for? And what kind of fixes are critical enough that we want to backport, right? What kind of tests we want to run in order to ensure whatever we're backporting is of good quality. Right, so that's the details. That's still TBD.
Thank you very much, Rita. Anyone else want to chime in on that one? Did you want to add to that, or you have a different question? Okay. All right, we'll take one more from the room, and then I've got a couple queuing up online as well. So
I had a question in regards to Linux container images. So I know Microsoft publishes a couple of container images themselves. Would you recommend going with those over something that just comes straight out of Docker? Or yeah, kind of which way do you recommend going there? And especially if there's something that Docker has a native image but Microsoft doesn't, is that an issue going with the Docker one?
all right, so good questions. So actually, we advertise a number of the images that we host through Docker Hub. Docker Hub is a great source for, it has been a tremendous enabler for our communities to be able to build and share container images. Now, when we start talking about what we're building for our environments, it can be fine to start our source there. But for me, and this applied for any kind of package management type of scenario that I had, upstream patches from Windows Update, I ran a WSUS server, or Windows Server Update Services. For I ran my own, apt mirrors, or the various package formats, right? If I was consuming NuGet packages in a .NET application, I would have Artifactory or something else caching in front of that. So we want to do this similar thing with our container images. If my build processes require things to be available, and now in Azure Container Registry, we have pull-through cache. So we can cache images from public sources locally. But I also want to make sure they go through a through some security review and audit, and so I know what the dependencies are in that package. And so using tools like Trivy and Copacetic, which are tools that were demonstrated in Josh's talk, and Rita will be showing off later today. We can, and then signing our images with a tool like Notation, we can start to build a chain of integrity for our container images. And So my production shouldn't have anything pulled directly just off Docker Hub. It should go through some validation on my side to make sure that I know what I'm rolling out into my environment, right? That maybe I've just run, I maybe didn't change anything or layer anything new. I've just ran my scans and I'm aware, but I have accounting for what I've rolled out into production.
Is there a Microsoft way, some sort of managed service to run some sort of security check on an image I pull from Docker Hub?
So I'm going to let Rita talk because her team does the container publishing for a lot of the open source CNCF projects for Microsoft. Or Toddy, you can jump in here too.
I actually can jump here because I deal a lot with container secure supply chain for Microsoft as well for our customers. Maybe the quick answer is at the moment we do not have anything that you can click a button and get it, but we are getting there. And I can speak about all the things that we are doing. So starting with actually the right name of the pull-through cache that Steven mentioned right now is Azure Cache. So you will see it in the portal as Azure Cache. But at the moment it works as a pull-through cache. So the image gets cached from Docker Hub into your own registry the first time when you request it. What we are working on is actually this to be done without even requesting the image. So you can go and create rules in Azure Cache where you can say, I would like, let's say, all Ubuntu images that are published after the first version of 2204 was published on Docker Hub to be also cached in my own ACR. And this will be automatic functionality that you will get later this year, at least in preview. Once actually you have that, so we can trigger a bunch of workflows for you. And the way that we are approaching it is, so we will have good integration with internal Azure services like, let's say, Defender. So if you use Microsoft Defender, that will be very nicely integrated. So once the image comes in, you will be able to get actually vulnerability report of that image. You can schedule either, depending on what kind of services used, but you can add, for example, signing of the image, or if the image comes without an SBOM, you can generate an SBOM for the image and all these things to prepare this image for internal use. What we believe is that these images that are coming from external vendors, they need to be enriched with more metadata so you can make decisions inside. So one of these metadata is, of course, the SBOM. Very few images right now in Docker Hub have SBOMs that actually you can automatically source. So you can produce the SBOM internally if you don't get it, but later on you can use that SBOM for, let's say, admission controls. Josh demonstrated yesterday how you can block the deployment of an image on Kubernetes cluster that doesn't get signature. And we are working not only to enforce these type of policies, but also policies like, I don't want to deploy any images that doesn't match my licenses, which will come from the SBOM, or I don't want to deploy any images that have critical vulnerabilities, which will come from the vulnerability reports. All this information will be attached to the image, and this is actually a broader community effort that we are participating in, which enables in the registries to not only store images, but also the additional metadata like SBOMs, vulnerability reports, signatures. We are thinking about lifecycle metadata for the images, because you can imagine that container image, because it's immutable, once it is produced, you cannot go and patch it, right? So you need to produce a new image. So if you're using an image that is produced a year ago, you can imagine how much vulnerabilities. So the lifecycle metadata of that image will tell you, okay, you're trying to use old image and so on. So things are coming. Most of those things are actually done in collaboration with the broader CNCF community, like OCI, like SBOMs, like SPDX or CycloneDX, tools like Notary, Ratify, COPA that Steve mentioned. They are all open source tools, and they can be used not only on Azure, but also for other on-premise deployments if you need to. in Azure, we will provide very nice integrations. Like, for example, if you want to deploy Ratify on your Kubernetes cluster, you don't need to run a bunch of bash scripts and commands. You can click a button and you'll have Ratify.
Yeah.
You can develop a Azure policy that blocks certain deployments as you do for any other things and so on.
So
hope that helps.
Yeah, and actually, Kara, did you want to maybe with your customer-facing experience, maybe want to chime in on this at all?
As Toddy has sort of alluded to, this is all a work in progress. And so just to keep that in mind when you're going down this secure supply chain path. But other than that, yes, a lot of the technologies that have been mentioned are very useful and can be implemented in various ways. We're also working, my team is working with customers that are operating.
Look closer to the mic.
Oh.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. My team is working with customers that are working at like high-low deployments. So the low deployment is less safe or working where your developers are connected to the internet, and then the high is disconnected, and figuring out using mirroring and other forms to ensure that you can enforce the your policies and also move the artifacts up and through the your different ACRs. But a lot of this is a work in progress, but there's a lot of stuff that's in flux and coming your way that is wonderful.
Yeah, and for like a base pattern, Josh's demo, which he can probably point you to the GitHub repo, can give you an example of a pattern that you can use locally. We do have a bunch of questions kind of queuing up here, so I'd like to get on to the next question, and it's coming back to some Linux topics here. So is there any plan to have Linux groups connected to Azure AD security groups to not only have the user and admin on the VM, but real integration with Azure AD? Jim, do you have any idea on this, or is this something we'll have to do a little research?
I think that is a research thing. That is not something my team has been working with. I know that there has been some effort to improve the Azure Active Directory support for Linux, and I'm not sure what features they are intending to add for that. That does sound on the surface like something that would be valuable, so yeah, I'm supportive, but I don't know if it's possible.
Okay. Aaron, have you heard anything around this?
I don't have anything to share on that, but there are, as Jim said, there's definitely efforts going on in the background for that sort of thing.
Oh, Andrew, in the mic, please.
I don't know if the question was just on Linux nodes, or like containerized workloads. But if it is containerized workloads, we do have workload identity solutions within Kubernetes. So again, I don't know the scope, but there is that.
Yeah, so you can use a managed identity and assign that to workloads inside of your Kubernetes cluster, which is very useful and actually used in a number of our secure supply chain examples. And we've got a question here for Paul. So Paul's been hanging out nice in the back. So Paul, is there a cloud native template such as a landing zone to help get started for development of .NET Core web apps running on Linux on Linux on AKS?
Landing zone, as
like
in,
or like a starter template, right? Like something that's gonna help you get started. Like what are the foundational things I need from a template perspective to get going?
Right. I would share that us being on the Cloud Native and Linux team, we do produce quite a bit of lab content, and that's all available at aka.ms/OSS-labs.
And we will have that on a slide at the tail end. We'll throw up a couple of resources for y'all.
Yeah.
That repository has a number of labs in the Linux and cloud native space. Like if you wanted to just kind of get started quickly with, or kick the tires on ARM64 VMs and see how those work, or fire up an AKS cluster with, with a web application gateway sitting in front. There's examples of all that kind of stuff there.
Yeah. And it's an open repository, so we welcome pull requests, suggestions. If there's something that's missing, feel free, fork it, submit an issue, we'll be more than happy to review that. So
we still have a little bit of time left. Do we have another question in the room? Otherwise, I've got a few online too, but we're just taking a couple from online, so I'd like to give you all a chance. Any other questions in the room here? Okay, we got another one here from our online viewers. So the question is, what different approaches or solutions to patch an Azure VM built with Linux, with the Linux custom image that is bring your own OS using Azure Image Builder? So I guess the question's around, is there a story or a common approach for patching your own custom image, your own custom Linux on Azure? So any thoughts from our panel? The silence is deafening. It is really tough to come up with patterns and recommendations when we come into the kind of the bring your own space, because it's bring your own, right? Like if I was asking for patching strategies for Azure Linux, I'm sure Jim would have a suggestion or two, or could just say, no, it's all up to date right now. You don't have to care about it.
The benefits of a managed service. No, for patching strategies, different in the bring your own image space, and for a lot of the larger customers we've got, they have their own in-house patching strategies for the way that they choose to roll applications out, or that they want to roll their updates out. Some drink from the fire hose and take patches as they come. Some have a quarterly release cycle. There are any number of different implementations that companies are using, and I don't, on our side, want to be prescriptive and turn around and tell a customer, hey, you're doing that wrong, unless they just say they're outright not taking patches. Then I'll absolutely tell them they're doing it wrong. Yeah. Beyond that, whatever they want to implement for their policy is fine. It's kind of our job to help support that as best we can.
Wonderful. Yeah, I remember when I was on the SRE team at Stack Overflow, we had built an in-house patching tool for patching our Windows and Linux VMs, so we could do it on the schedules that we wanted in a kind of coordinated fashion. Patching is can definitely be a very individualized by organizations story.
Can I talk about how AKS patches its own?
No. Yes,
Okay.
Of course you can. Of course.
Well, this is more, I guess, like both OS level vulnerabilities as well as container level vulnerabilities. So if you go to Microsoft's docs, like you could probably find AKS has a feature for node level upgrades. So with this feature turned on, you can actually specify or you can even schedule how often when you want to update the AKS VHDs. The nice thing about that is whenever AKS updates the packages as well as container images, you get it for free, which is super nice. And another reason why that's important is, again, you make sure that you don't have any vulnerable images or packages running on the AKS nodes. A lot of people don't know this feature is there, so please, try it.
Yeah, I've actually got some related product feedback for you around that. That reminds me. So, but I won't tie everyone up here with that. There was another question that came in around building golden container images. So I will open that up. So it was really just like strategies or ideas around golden container images. So I will open that up to Toddy and Kara and Josh and Rita and whoever wants to jump in. Toddy looks eager. He can't wait.
I can't wait. Yes, to answer all the questions about container image. It's a very broad topic, and I think I mentioned some of the things that we are doing in Azure, how they can help. One of the things is that we've seen, so depending on the kind of the enterprise or the company, they may have different rules for what the container image is, right? So we internally in Microsoft, we have certain rules, like one of them is use Azure Linux as much as possible, right? This will be the container base image that we'll recommend most of the times. Of course, in certain situations, we have teams that they cannot use Azure Linux. Sorry, Mariner, old name still on my tongue. Yeah. Typical situation like that are, for example, .NET team produces images for our customers, and our customers require that actually they have Alpine-based .NET image, right? And that's what they need to do. In such cases, we need to make certain versions of Alpine also allowed internally. And if you think about that, that's another golden image. We may not want to use Alpine for our services because we prefer Azure Linux, but we need to have a process that actually we can acquire the Alpine image and make it available. Part of the things that I answered in the previous question are like using Azure ACR cache, sorry, and triggering certain workflows. We do the same thing for this type of images, right? When we acquire them outside. The other thing is we publish them on an internal kind of portal, which is very similar to Docker Hub, where internal teams can go and search for those images and find the approved images that they can use internally. From there on, of course, those images are constantly scanned for vulnerabilities on a daily basis. And if they actually have any violations on the internal policies, we can take them down from the internal portal, and they may not be actually allowed for further use. But those are kind of the steps that we are taking. Once again, depending on the internal company policies.
Sorry to jump in here because we've only got a minute left. Aaron, could you share the slide with the resources links? And I asked in chat, and I'll just vocalize it here. If you could capture any of the questions that were remaining from the chat, and what I'll do after build is I'll get a blog post up on dev.to and answer as many of those as we can. Or at least get some pointers towards documentation or things like that. So thank you all, everyone who is on. I'll let you give you a second here, but I just want to make sure I get a thank you out to everyone who came in person, as well as all of you who joined us online. And thank you so much to our panel, who most of whom we dragooned out of the hallway as we came in here. Aaron, what was your final words?
Yes, if you can see the resources on the screen here, we have our open source labs. I'll also mention we have our Microsoft open source Discord. So for folks who've got questions and like to follow up, particularly around a specific scenario, you can just go to aka.ms/open-source-discord, and various of us are there. I would love to dive in more deeply to some of the scenarios. And if you do have any Linux and cloud native scenarios that you would like to dive in to deeply, we'd love to talk more about those and connect you with various product teams and so forth.
Thank you very much.